Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most devastating pandemics. It's the Black Death. But we're not just going to talk about the tragedy. We're going to uncover a surprising, almost unbelievable silver lining that emerged from the ashes. How the plague completely revolutionized the lives of ordinary workers and peasants across Europe. It's a story of how a catastrophic event accidentally handed immense power to the common people, leading to what some historians call a golden age of labor. So how did the deadliest pandemic in human history lead to higher wages, better food, and more freedom for the working class? Let's get into it. To understand the massive shift, you first need to paint a picture of Europe before the plague struck in the mid-14th century. The continent was overpopulated. Land was scarce, and most people were serfs, tied to the land they worked. They were essentially the property of their lord, living under a rigid feudal system. Wages were pitifully low, because there was always someone else desperate for work. A landlord could pay next to nothing because if a peasant complained, there were 10 others ready to take their place. Life was a constant struggle for survival, with little hope for social mobility or a better future. Peasants worked long, grueling hours for a meager share of the harvest, and their diet was mostly bread and porridge. This was the world the Black Death was about to shatter. And between 1347 and 1351, the bubonic plague swept across Europe with terrifying speed and lethality. The estimates are staggering, suggesting that it wiped out anywhere from 30% to 60% of Europe's population. In some towns and villages, the death toll was even higher. Imagine entire communities vanishing in a matter of months. This massive sudden depopulation created a crisis unlike any other. Fields were left unplowed, harvests rotted, and livestock wandered untended. The very foundation of the feudal economy, which was built on an endless supply of cheap labor, crumbled almost overnight. Suddenly, the tables were turned. With so many workers gone, labor became an incredibly scarce and valuable commodity. For the first time in centuries, the surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of power. Landlords who once had dozens of people begging for work were now desperate to find anyone to till their fields and tend their flocks. This desperation meant they had to compete for workers. And how do you compete? You offer better terms. This led to a dramatic and unprecedented rise in wages. Historical records from England, for example, show that a farm laborer's wages could double or even triple in the years immediately following the plague. A skilled artisan like a carpenter or mason saw their pay skyrocket. They were in such high demand that they could essentially name their price. This wasn't just a small pay bump. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of economic power. For the first time, ordinary people had real bargaining power. They could refuse low-paying work and move to another estate or town that offered a better deal. This new mobility was revolutionary. Before the plague, a serf was bound to their lord's manor. Leaving was illegal. But after the plague, with lords desperate for help, these rules became impossible to enforce. Peasants began to abandon their ancestral lands in search of higher wages and greater freedom. This movement of people further weakened the old feudal ties and gave rise to a more fluid, modern labor market. A serf could realistically dream of becoming a free tenant farmer or a well-paid craftsman in a bustling city. The world of rigid social hierarchy was beginning to crack. The elite, of course, did not take this lying down. The ruling class, the kings and nobles, were horrified. Their wealth and lifestyle depended on cheap, subservient labor. They saw their power slipping away and tried to fight back. Across Europe, governments enacted laws to try and force wages back down to pre-plague levels. In England, this was the famous Statute of Labourers of 1351. It made it illegal for employers to pay more than the old rates and legal for workers to demand more. It even tried to stop peasants from moving around to find better work. But these laws were a spectacular failure. They were almost impossible to enforce. The economic reality was simple. There were not enough workers. A lord might legally be forbidden from paying more, but if the choice was between breaking the law or letting his entire harvest rot in the field, he was going to pay up. Workers and employers often colluded to get around the laws, with payments being made in kind like extra food, clothing, or better housing instead of just cash. The government's attempts to turn back the clock only highlighted how much power the workers had actually gained. This newfound economic power had a direct impact on the daily lives of the common people. With higher wages, they could afford better food. Their diets became more varied and nutritious. Instead of just subsisting on grains, they could now afford more meat, fish, dairy products, and ale. Archaeological evidence from this period shows a marked improvement in the health and stature of the general population. People were literally getting taller and stronger because they were eating better. They could also afford better clothing and improvements to their homes. The standard of living for the average person in the late 14th century was likely higher than it had been for their grandparents, or would be for their great-grandchildren a century later. The psychological impact was just as profound. The survivors of the plague saw the old world order collapse. They witnessed priests and nobles dying just as easily as peasants. This challenged the idea that the social hierarchy was divinely ordained. It fostered a new sense of self-worth and assertiveness among the working class. When authorities tried to clamp down on their new freedoms and wages, it often led to open rebellion. The most famous example is the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. A massive uprising fueled by resentment against wage controls and oppressive taxes. Although the revolt was ultimately crushed, it sent a clear message to the ruling class. The old days of unquestioning servitude were over. So, in the end, the Black Death, while an unimaginable tragedy, acted as a violent and unexpected catalyst for profound social and economic change. It shattered the rigid structures of feudalism, dramatically increased the value and power of labor, and paved the way for the emergence of a new kind of society. It accelerated the end of serfdom in many parts of Western Europe and laid the groundwork for a more modern, market-based economy. It's a powerful reminder that history is full of unintended consequences, and that even in the darkest of times, the seeds of a new and different world can be sown. The story of the Black Death's impact on labor isn't just about economics. It's about the resilience of ordinary people and their timeless struggle for a better life. Thanks so much for watching. What other historical turning points would you like to see us cover? Let me know down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video and learned something new, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next one.